Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into a question that highlights their area of expertise. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you can use to make your workplace better and more human-friendly. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm a DEI educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinoochtan and the Haudenosaunee peoples. On today's episode, I have the pleasure of bringing you a conversation with Dr. Steve Bland. Dr. Steve Bland is an associate professor in the philosophy department at Huron University, which, for those of you who don't know, is an affiliated university college of the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, Canada. His work focuses on the intersection of empirical science and philosophical theory. His most recent book, Rationality in Context: Unstable Virtues in an Uncertain World, was published this year by Routledge. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks, Dominique. Happy to be here.
I'm really glad to have you here, and I'm super excited for this conversation. The key question that we're going to explore today is, how can organizations support intellectual humility? And I think that this is the first time a philosopher has joined the podcast, so you have the privilege of being the first, and I appreciate your willingness to come on and talk about this really important topic.
It's my pleasure to say it's nice to branch out, right? And interdisciplinarity, I think, only benefits everyone.
Absolutely. So I'd like to just open the floor to you right away by asking you basically, what is intellectual humility, this thing that you've been studying? And perhaps you can tell us what the differences are between somebody who would have very high intellectual humility and someone who has none.
Yeah, so as you might expect, and as you might think of kind of philosophy and philosophers, there are various conceptions of intellectual humility, different characterizations, different definitions, and so on. But the one that has the most traction, at least recently among philosophers and psychologists, is that it's a disposition to recognize and own one's intellectual limitations. So it's a kind of species of humility more generally. We think of humble people as
Mm.
people who kind of are aware of what they can and can't do, that kind of important guideline that they know they shouldn't pass, kind of what tasks to take on, what tasks are beyond them, and so on. Intellectual humility is kind of a species of humility more generally, where we're thinking specifically about the kinds of intellectual limitations that people have. So it could be kind of gaps in knowledge or biases or other kinds of weaknesses that people are aware of and then kind of behave accordingly. So you're asking about kind of what that looks like. Individuals who manifest intellectual humility are quick to ask for help and guidance. They look for other people's points of view. They often can inhabit more than one perspective because they're aware that any given perspective is going to have blind spots. They react to evidence and are sensitive to evidence, especially against the kinds of beliefs that they already have. And so they are aware of the fact that, I could be wrong about any
Mm.
given thing, no matter how strongly I feel about it. And so I'm going to kind of open myself up to that possibility and to the possibility of having to change my mind as new evidence comes in. So these are all kind of characteristic behaviors that we would expect to see from someone who is intellectually humble. A virtue is kind of in a golden mean, is what Aristotle called it, between kind of extremes of excess and deficiency. So someone who is not intellectually humble can do so because they don't have enough humility, and that would be kind of intellectual arrogance, right? So someone who thinks that they are always right, or that their opinions hold more weight, or that they don't need to ask the people around them because they already know. They think they have expertise that they do not, in fact, have. They are not open to countervailing evidence. That's all kind of on the extreme of not enough intellectual humility. And having too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. Having too much is kind of an intellectual servitude,
Mm.
where you are too reticent to kind of form views of your own, even when you're pretty well informed. You don't tend to speak up, even if you have kind of relevant knowledge or expertise when you should. So it's kind of a continuum where
Right.
we find humility in the kind of sweet spot where we want to be.
Mm. And I mean, I can think of my own answers, but I'm going to be lazy and ask you, why does this matter to our workplaces? Like, why would we want to have somebody who has just the right amount of intellectual humility, which I guess is somewhere in the middle, but sort of more on the higher side, if I'm understanding you correctly? What does this person bring to the workplace and then, I guess, to society more broadly?
Yeah, so this is more, in my view, this is more a question for psychologists than for philosophers. Now, I often work kind of at that intersection, so I have a pretty good acquaintance with the empirical literature, and what it says is that intellectual humility is associated with all kinds of positive characteristics. So things like general levels of bias and information processing, things like polarization, outgroup bias, all of these are associated with, so in the case of a lack of bias or information processing, that's associated with intellectual humility,
Mm,
whereas intellectual arrogance is associated with higher levels of certain kinds of biases, especially social biases. So people who are low in intellectual humility or high in intellectual arrogance tend to think that there's something special about their group, that their group has kind of a purchase on the truth, that others tend to be wrong, therefore, and are not worth listening to.
mm,
So not only are they slow to change their minds, they're slow to go through the process of acquiring the kinds of evidence that would change their mind, since most evidence is social. And most of
yeah,
the evidence that we get is from other people. And if we're not asking other people and listening to other people when it comes to the questions that concern us, then we're just not getting the evidence. And it's harder to have an evidence-based point of view or judgment.
for
So people
sure.
who are higher in intellectual humility are more likely to have kind of those well-calibrated judgments, that they're calibrated both to the evidence, but also their level of confidence tends to be a pretty good indication of the likelihood of their belief being true.
Hmm. I can just draw from my own experience in DEI. We call those types of people who I guess are intellectually arrogant or have a lower intellectual humility resistant. That's sort of the short form that we use for that. And I think in most L&D type roles, this is a very common type of person that you would encounter when you're trying to teach something, especially behavior change in the context of a workplace. You will always encounter people who are easier to teach than others. And sometimes it's a big challenge because, as we know, every kind of change requires sort of everyone to move along together, and you can only move often at the pace of the slowest person. So there is definitely some issues there when we have this resistance or this fracturing of people's opinion or how people are interpreting the same information and the same facts, the same experiences within a learning context too, right? So that's I guess my experience, and I think that you know HR, people and culture, learning and development folks broadly will know that organizations spend a ton of resources trying to teach individuals to be more humble, to consider the perspectives of others, to collaborate, sort of to break through that resistance. What are the key challenges with sort of teaching intellectual humility at that individual level?
Yeah, great. So the kind of two parts of what you're saying there go really well together. So on the one hand, you're absolutely right. So intellectual humility is important to something that I don't think I did mention, which is learning. So as an
Hmm.
educator myself, as a professor, it's quite clear to me that those students, those learners who are high in intellectual humility, tend to learn at a faster pace precisely because they're better aware of what their limitations are, what they know better what they don't know. And so being in a classroom for them is an opportunity to fill some of those gaps which they're aware they have. Now, if you think about someone who is low in intellectual humility, higher in arrogance, it's the kind of person who isn't aware of what they don't know. And so in a classroom or a training exercise, maybe more casual, not as attentive, not paying as much attention because they think they already know what the person who is leading the session or the classroom is saying. You might get some eye rolling, right? Everything seems obvious. And if you're in that situation and you're thinking to yourself, boy, I already know all of this, that's an indication that maybe you should slow down and think harder about what you might be missing. So, from that to what are the challenges of teaching intellectual humility? So, to put my cards on the table, I think that character change generally is
Mm,
very, very difficult. It takes a long time. It takes deep commitment. It takes the right kinds of incentives for people to change their habitual behaviors in any particular way. Often we're trying to change them in positive ways, right? We're not trying to be worse people. We're trying to be better. But doing that is challenging in general. With humility, it can be extra challenging for the reason that I had just alluded to, which is those people who are lowest in humility tend to be precisely the people who don't recognize when they should be more humble, right? So
right.
intellectual humility is the tendency to recognize and own one's intellectual limitations or deficits. A lack of intellectual humility is itself a deficit, and so it's going to be less likely to be recognized by someone who is intellectually arrogant, for example.
It's a bit of a catch
So,
22 there. Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So you can teach, there are techniques for trying to boost intellectual humility. So one of them, for example, I think probably the oldest one in the literature is an exercise called Consider the Opposite. It's a really valuable exercise when it's done in the lab, and it's done for all kinds of different reasons. It tends to mitigate things like confirmation bias, hindsight bias, but is also a way of trying to boost intellectual humility, in part because it can reveal some of the biases that we didn't know that we have.
Mm.
So the exercise goes like this. You ask people to consider, so you take a conviction that they have or a belief that they have, a judgment, and then you ask them, okay, suppose you're wrong about this. What might have led you astray? What might you be wrong about? Right? So the considering the opposite is, well, consider the opposite of what I actually believe, right? Imagine that that's true. And now ask yourself, well, if it's true and I don't believe that it's true, what explains that disconnect?
Yeah.
Why is it?
This sounds like a high school debate exercise.
Yeah, a debate is so it's like a debate exercise, except you're doing it on your own. It's
Yeah.
a self-deployed strategy. Right now, in a laboratory context, you get the prompt, right? Okay, so what do you believe about X? What do you believe about a cap and trade system of controlling carbon emissions? And okay, now how might you be wrong? Right? If you were wrong, why would you be wrong? Right? What are the weak points of your argument? And so you're kind of vacillating between each side of the debate yourself. So two problems. One is we're not very good at doing this when we have a conviction, especially if it's a conviction that's important to us,
Mm.
if it's aligned with our identities, so especially political convictions, we tend to produce lots and lots and lots of reasons why we're right and very few reasons why we're wrong. The reasons we have for thinking we're right tend to be better than the reasons we have for thinking that we're wrong, and so on, right? So if you're asking someone, well, how could you be wrong? And they're coming up with reasons, those reasons may not be the best reasons to consider, right? So in a debate, your opponent is motivated to give you the very best reasons why they think you're wrong.
Right.
Right? In your own case, if it's something you want to hang on to, I'm not saying that this is a conscious process. Much of this happens kind of under the hood, right? So it's unconscious, subconscious, if you like. So we want to hold on to this belief for one reason or another. Then we have an interest in coming up with reasons that ultimately we can overcome.
Right. You're
So
going to give yourself the softball argument every time.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's the first problem. It's the smaller of the two problems. The second problem is that this is, as a self-directed strategy, we have to recognize when and how to deploy it, right? So we have to be in a situation where we think, okay, I have this belief, but I might be wrong. And if I were wrong, why might I be wrong? Okay, here are all the reasons. Do I still think I'm right? And so on.
It
Now
sounds
that
like
is a,
that sounds like an intellectually humble person.
yeah, right? So
Yeah.
this is the issue
Yeah.
is it's a self-deployed strategy that has to be used at the discretion of the agent. Now, if the person is not already intellectually humble, and not likely to recognize when it is that they should use the strategy, then they're just not going to use it. And
Hmm.
if they do end up using it, they're probably not going to use it very well. So I think this way about a lot of interventions, especially character-based interventions that we have of trying to boost things like open-mindedness and humility and creativity. I think that you can do it in a very supportive environment, but a lot of the change depends on the environment and not
Mm.
just the intervention. That when you get these things out in the wild, as it were, outside of this highly artificial laboratory context, in the messy world, they don't work nearly as well. And I think that this is typically true of most interventions when it comes to intellectual humility. Now, I should also say lots of great work is being done on this. It's a very popular subject. Lots of my friends and colleagues are working on it. So, maybe they'll come up with some really robust intervention that has huge effects across different kinds of circumstances. But I don't see it right now, and
Mm.
I am pessimistic about these kinds of interventions in general.
So are we doomed? Like, if it's really that hard to make intellectual humility stick on an individual level, what else can we do to access it?
Yeah, so it depends what you mean by doomed, I guess. It's I don't think things are that bad. I think a couple of things have to happen. One is we have to recognize, as I said, it's very, very difficult to change the way people think and behave. People tend to, their character traits tend to be fairly deep-seated. For whatever reason, that can be partly because they have kind of an innate kind of predisposition to be a certain kind of person. It could be because of their upbringing or habits that they've acquired throughout decades. But one way or another, my inclination is to think that it's very, very hard to change the way people think. So part of it is, are we doomed never to perfectly realize intellectual humility altogether? Yes, I think we're doomed in that way, but doomed seems strong for that.
My apologies. I didn't mean to use the D word.
No, no, it's good. I think that it's important to understand kind of what the target is. And I think
Yeah.
oftentimes we set ourselves targets that aren't realistic. And
Mm.
then when we realize that we can't hit them, we think, oh, okay, well, I guess we shouldn't really bother. I think we should bother because it's really important. But what we need to do is be more realistic about what the kinds of changes, the size of the effects that we're looking for. And what we really need is a change of approach, that we need to focus less on individuals as the targets of change and focus more on the environments in which individuals are making judgments and decisions. So, as I said a moment ago, a laboratory is a very supportive environment, right? So if you have, say, an experimentalist saying, okay, now, how strongly do you feel about this? And
Yeah.
imagine that you're wrong, and why might you be wrong, right? That's a lot of environmental support that keeps this kind of strategy moving. What I think we need more often is this kind of environmental support. So rather than focusing on the individuals and trying to make them humble across all the different types of environments that they might inhabit, so these could be different workplace environments or also kind of personal environments, whatever they are, I think we need to focus more on the environments themselves and have more of a collective commitment to intellectual humility as something that we want to foster in groups of people, in collectives of people.
Hmm.
So in a boardroom or in an organization or in a community, that we be jointly committed to this objective, recognizing in a humble way that is very difficult to meet,
Hmm.
and that doing so is going to require that we change some of the circumstances in which we interact with one another.
Hmm. What are some examples of the changes to the circumstances that could lead us to collective intellectual humility?
Yeah, so I think the fundamental leverage here has to do with a fundamental feature of our lack of humility. So I think humility is difficult to cultivate, difficult to come by, in part because we have this tendency to overestimate our strengths and underestimate our weaknesses. The size of that kind of asymmetry is not universal, that the different cultures will manifest different kind of magnitude differences here,
Mm.
but certainly in the West, we seem to be kind of on the we seem to be outliers. We tend to be kind of on the extreme, where, as I say, we overestimate our strengths, underestimate our weaknesses. So there are these two fairly robust results that we can point to here. One is the better than average effect, which is if you take a trait that is socially desirable, so intelligence, open-mindedness, leadership, and you ask people kind of where do you think you are in the distribution, in the population distribution? Where do you think you are? What percentile would you put yourself in these kinds of traits? What you find is the vast majority of the population puts themselves at least at about the 50th percentile, so 50% or above. Right?
Right.
Now, of course, that's a statistical impossibility. You can't have 90% of the population as being above average.
Right.
But that's exactly what you see, right? It can be even innocent stuff with, driving ability. And most people think they're better drivers than they actually are, and it causes accidents. More people think that they're more open-minded than they actually are, and it causes mistakes. The other result is what's called the bias blind spot. So it's the tendency that we have to recognize pretty well the biases in other people's thinking, but not recognize as readily the biases in our own, even when they're the same biases.
Mm.
So
Mm.
when you teach students, as I do, what confirmation bias is, for example, so the tendency to preferentially look for and accept evidence that favors what you believe, and to ignore or discount evidence against what you believe, students are then very good at finding that bias in their classmates and in their family and their friends. And they'll come up to me after class and they'll, recount these discussions that they had with their friends and say, ah, aha, that's just confirmation bias. Very rarely will I get a student who say, I was thinking the other day about this topic and I realized I was suffering from confirmation bias.
It's
Right?
like,
So
gosh, my Instagram feed looks all the same. How did that happen?
yeah, and wow, I agree with a lot of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the so this tendency is really problematic when we're thinking on our own, because what it means is that we're really vigilant when we are assessing information that's coming in from other people, but we don't exercise that same level of vigilance when it comes to ourselves.
Hmm.
Now, again, this is problematic for intellectual humility, but it also gives us a clue about how to address it and why collectivist contexts are so valuable.
Right, because we can point it out in others more easily.
That's exactly it,
Right.
right? So here's the thing. If I am better off recognizing your biases than mine, and you're better off recognizing my biases than yours, then when we're in a discussion or we're deliberating, right, we can outsource that kind of corrective task to one another.
Hmm.
As you were saying with the debate, right? So I will trust you to tell me why you think you're wrong and vice versa.
Hmm.
And so in those kinds of contexts, when you let people just, so notice, like, you don't need to change anything about the individuals in these contexts. You let them be who they are, right?
Hmm.
So okay, you have this bias blind spot, but we can harness it, right, such that the outcomes of our collective deliberation are better off because I've thought of all the reasons I'm right and you're wrong, and you've thought of all the reasons you're right and I'm wrong. And instead of having to do it individually, as separate deliberate as separate persons, right? And think, okay, what's all the evidence against this? What's all the evidence for it? That's a really cognitive demanding task.
Hmm.
And so by kind of dividing the labor among a group that are well disposed to do different functions, right? Stress testing different views, as long as they're receptive to the deliberation that's going on within the group, you actually get a much, much better result than you could just by trying to boost every individual's intellectual humility, right? So
Right.
it's the collective dynamics that are doing all the work there, as opposed to kind of individualistic or agent-based training.
I guess this is assuming that people are, in a workplace context anyway, comfortable with challenging one another. Is that an issue? I mean, if you have people who are intellectually humble and they are presented with an opposing perspective, they might, or maybe they're even on that low end of the spectrum and they don't have the ability to kind of counter that. Is that a problem?
Yes. So,
Okay.
a collective dynamics can go one way or the other. So, in some kinds of collectivist situations, the collective can end up worse than the average individual. And in other situations, they can end up much better.
Hmm.
Now, in deliberative contexts, which are many of the ordinary contexts of an organization or an institution, right, where we're all sitting around the table and we're talking about the advantages and drawbacks of a particular decision, innovation, direction, plan, strategy, whatever it is, right? We're exchanging reasons for why this is or is not a good idea. Now, if one person exerts either purposely or just incidentally a lot of influence over others, then you can get this kind of herding behavior where the group has all kinds of information that bears on the question. But because the first person says, well, we could go in direction A or we could go in direction B, and I think A is the way to go.
Right.
Now, if the next person, as you say, is kind of, is too high in intellectual humility, a little bit too intellectually servile, they might think, well, it's a pretty smart person, and I I I have I know that B has drawbacks, but I'm going to side with B as well. And now you have the weight of two people's opinions, right? And it starts what's called a cascade.
Hmm.
So it's like a set of dominoes that all fall in the same direction. And you have this kind of herding behavior, and all of the contrary information is effectively suppressed, right?
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
get all of the evidence against the original point of view. So dissent is very, very important in these kinds of situations. You need someone to stand up and say, if it's the sixth person and 1 through 5 have all said B, you need someone to stand up and say, I recognize that there are reasons for B, but I also think A has some merits and B has some weaknesses, and here's what I think they are. So dissent is oftentimes a very, very, very important feature of these kinds of conversational or deliberative contexts.
Hmm.
If everyone starts off on the same page, or everyone ends up on the same page really quickly,
Right.
something's probably gone wrong, and your group has probably turned into or reasoned like a very biased individual.
So I'm hearing a couple of things. Like I'm hearing there's a lesson for leaders in there where the order of speech matters in terms of like if you have a position of power or you exert influence at an outsized level, you probably shouldn't be sharing your opinion first. And the other thing I'm hearing is you kind of do need some people who might be a little bit lower on the intellectual humility spectrum in the room. Am I right? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
So it's a very, very tricky thing here. So one of the counterintuitive views that I have is that a lack of intellectual humility, that is to say, some intellectual arrogance, can be a very good thing in collective contexts.
Hmm.
And the reason is because it can support dissent. So imagine that sixth person, 1 through 5, have all given their views, and they're all the same view. And they may have even given a few reasons for this view. Now the pressure is on you, right? And whether we recognize it or want to admit to it or not, social pressure is very difficult to resist, right?
Hmm.
It takes a kind of courage and independence and conviction, right? If you're going to be the one who dissents, if you're going to be the one to say, I respect all of your viewpoints, but I think you're wrong. Right? And dissent is most powerful. In fact, it's only effective if it is consistent. That is to say, if you're kind of hesitant and well, you might be wrong, and maybe this is that's far less effective than no, I'm going to challenge you on this. I think you're wrong, and I'm going to give you the reasons, and then we can deliberate about it. Now, to overcome that kind of social pressure, as I say, so courage can be one trait that you might have that would help you. But also, if you really think you're right,
Hmm.
and you think you're in a better position to know whether or not you're right than the other people in the room, you're more likely to express the view that you have, support it with information, and that act can compel other people in the room to express the information. So it might give someone else the courage to say, yeah, actually, I think A is right as well. And it then challenges the first five people to produce more evidence in favor of their view. Now, here's where it gets tricky. You have to be kind of fortunate in this way. So, a moderate amount of intellectual arrogance is really useful when it's on the side of kind of minority dissent, right?
Right.
For exactly the reasons that I outlined. On the other hand, if the first five people arrogantly say, obviously, it's B, and no one could think otherwise, you're just ratcheting up the pressure, right, to conform to what everyone else is saying. And as you say, the worst thing that a leader can do is to say confidently at the beginning of a set of deliberations, I really think B is the way to go, but what do you think?
Yeah.
That's, yeah, that is almost a guarantee to produce a kind of groupthink situation, right? A kind of consensus building exercise rather than a truly deliberative exercise. So the two features that are really important from leaders in this respect is that they be self-silencing.
Mm.
So you hold your view to the end, not the beginning, right? You want to minimize the chances of your contribution influencing everyone else's and such that everyone else in the room is starting to self-silence. They're not being forthcoming with the information that they have.
Mm.
So self-silencing, keep it to the end,
Yep.
and just as important is that they are inquisitive. So naturally, in a social setting, especially one among a group that kind of already has dynamics, there will be people who are more or less talkative, right? That's also kind of a trait that people can have. So some people kind of like the spotlight. I mean, I guess saying liking the sound of their own voice is maybe a little judgmental, but
Sure.
yeah,
We all
I'm one
know
of these people.
someone.
Yeah.
It's not the two people on this podcast right now, right? Talking into microphones.
So
No.
this is the thing, right? And the more you speak, typically, the more influence you tend to have. Means, of course, the less you speak, the less influence you have, which is not surprising, right? If you're saying more, then
Hmm.
more of what you think is having more of an influence on what's happening in the collective dynamic, because there's just more out there. But also, if you are kind of gregarious and confident and charismatic, that really creates a pretty strong pressure to conform. Now, the job of a leader in this situation is to inquire with everyone, but especially those people who tend to be less talkative, more shy, more insecure, to ask them what they think. And perhaps the ideal situation is to start off a meeting asking them what they think so that they don't feel a ton of pressure to conform,
Mm. Hmm.
right? And so what your job as a leader, if you're trying to produce the best judgment or decision outcome, is to maximize the amount of information, relevant information that's exchanged, and to optimize the process of exchange so that you quickly get to the best arguments for and against each view. And the best way to do that is to involve, right, to create broad participation because cognitive diversity is a huge superpower that collectives have that individuals don't,
Mm.
kind of by definition. right? So a single person, you can be kind of open-minded and entertain various perspectives. We're not very good at it. So even there, but you yourself, you can try and think like a crowd, but we're not very good at it. You know who thinks exactly like a crowd? A
A
crowd.
crowd, yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we need. But a crowd only thinks like a crowd when it minimizes conformity and leverages dissent. So that
Mm.
can happen either naturally through someone who is overconfident in their view and in the minority, in which case that's great. You let them do their thing. Make sure that they are supported, that they're not silenced by other people in the room. But when you don't have that dynamic, or worse, when you have the dynamic where the one side, the dominant side, the majority view, is being spoken and advocated by the most confident and talkative in the room, then the job of a facilitator or a leader is to
Mm.
to be inquisitive with those people who are saying less, to try and find that dissenter, that dissenting voice, and kind of coax them out. Not if it's an easy problem. So, this all of this applies to problems that are complex and difficult, which, if we're meeting to talk about it, it probably is, because simple, straightforward problems can often be solved in an email, uh,
Yeah. Say that
um,
again.
or by individuals. But
Yeah.
when it's harder, when it requires many minds, that's what you need. You need
Mm.
that give and take, the back and forth, but that balance can be really hard to strike and to maintain.
Mm.
And that's one of the really fundamental jobs of a facilitator or a leader, at least when we're talking about kind of hierarchical organizations, where there is such a person, as opposed to like a scientific community where there is no king or queen scientist. It's the scientists themselves, right?
Right.
It's a kind of self-organized collective I mean, there are hierarchies. There aren't often single decision-making bodies that hold for all of science.
Mm.
But in organizations where you have that kind of hierarchy, the person in the room that is highest on that hierarchy has a responsibility to try and make sure that the discussion, the conversation is as productive as possible. And the best way of doing that when it comes to trying to make the group as humble as possible is by being inquisitive and self-silencing.
Mm. So, how do we know when we've achieved sort of a result that demonstrates our collective intellectual humility? Or do you have any examples of, the end result of that process and how it might be different from one that is driven by a kind of a polarization or, yeah, that's a little bit less successful in finding that humble ground?
What it looks like is, so the reason humility is so valuable, just like lots of other kind of intellectually valuable traits, is that it tends to maximize our successes or achievements. And it does this in a very particular way. So other kinds of virtues or competences help us succeed by better positioning us to complete the tasks that we take on. Humility, a big part of humility is choosing the tasks to take on and how to take them on. Right? So someone who lacks humility will take on something that they are just not well equipped to do.
Right.
I am in no position to throw out opinions and comment on kind of virology, for example,
Sure.
right? That's just not. I'm a philosopher. I know very little about virology. It wouldn't make sense for me to start a blog about virology and talk all about how we ought to respond and prepare, and right, that someone who is humble recognizes, oh, this is just not the kind of thing I'm well equipped to do. So oftentimes with individuals and collectives, when they are humble, they tend to take on the right kinds of projects and
Mm.
engage in them in ways that maximize their chances of success.
Right.
So you were asking for an example. So let's go back to science for an example. More than 10 years ago now, the social and life sciences were thrown into what is sometimes called a replication crisis. Now, what this was it was really because of dynamics that have been going on for decades, but the crisis was the realization that lots of research in very important disciplines like psychology didn't replicate very well.
Mm.
In other words, if you run the same kind of experiment as someone else did, where they published a result in the literature, the result that you get is surprisingly likely to be different, which is problematic, to say the least, for the reliability of the literature, right? So you would think, okay, if our literature is really reliable, then we ought to be finding the same things under similar conditions over and over and over again. And when we replicate an experiment, we're also kind of replicating the results.
Of
And
course.
when you don't get, yeah, ideally,
Yeah.
when you don't get that, then it shows you that something is wrong. So this was a case where I think a couple of things were at play. One is scientists were trying to do very big things with the wrong kinds of tools. So let's take psychology and social psychology, because that's something about which I know something. So, very, very difficult discipline, right? Explaining human behavior is really difficult to do because it's so complex. Right? So everything is a multivariate phenomenon when you're talking about human beings and their interactions, right? Especially kind of human beings in social context. Now, you have all of these studies that are being published about how human beings think and how they interact and how the environment influences their behavior. And you get these results that are being produced with very small samples from lots and lots of trials, but the results are kind of they're cherry picked, right?
Mm.
So what you got was a skewed idea of what's actually happening. So the statistical methods that were being used were not up to the task. The sample sizes were not nearly large enough, and that's when you get a failure to replicate and a problem of reliability. Now, in the face of all of that, a small group of scientists now turned into a much larger group, known as the Open Science Movement, called for kinds of intellectual reforms that would better kind of fit the objectives that scientists have of getting things right to the methods that they have, including, as the name suggests, using kind of open practices such that if I'm running a study, I make all of my data and my methods and my protocols public because I am not a reliable person to know if there's a problem with them,
Mm.
but everyone else is better positioned, right? So again, this kind of self-other asymmetry, the bias blind spot, by making all of this open to view to my colleagues, I make it more likely that they can act as an external check on me if there's something wrong with my study. So you've had kind of really pretty remarkable reform in these sciences. It's far from ideal, far from complete, but the movement has been, to my mind anyways, surprisingly successful over the last dozen years or so. And you have a ever larger community of scientists who are saying, there's a lot that I don't trust in the published literature in my own discipline,
Mm.
and we need to be better, and we need to hold one another to account, and we need the right kinds of environments and incentives in which to practice open science. And that is both humble and humbling, right?
Mm.
The whole replication crisis is really a crisis of confidence in these disciplines. And so it's been, I think, for the scientists involved, at least the ones that I know, a tremendously humbling experience. But science is way, way better off as a result.
Yeah.
And it looks now like the replication rates are far, far better. In some disciplines, that studies are replicating at twice the rate that they were. Now closer to kind of 80% in parts of psychology as opposed to 40%. So, like, that is a huge, huge difference. But it took a cultural shift. It
Right.
wasn't, okay, we're going to give you all of these scientists training in how to be more humble. No, none of that went on, right? They tackled it as a community and
Mm.
became a much more humble collective,
Right.
keeping one another to account. And recognizing both the limitations of their colleagues and of the discipline, even if they still weren't so great at recognizing their own limitations.
Right. So bring that back to the regular workplace for me. What I think, like, what you're saying is there are sort of structural aspects of this as well, not just, interpersonal ones, but we can actually build systems that have a little bit more accountability baked in so that we're supporting a process that sort of achieves collective intellectual humility in our workplaces. So what can this look like in practice for the average company?
Yeah. So in my work, I identify five different features of what I call humbling environments. So they're humbling because becoming humble is really the goal, not not being humble, right?
Mm,
Being humble makes it sound like, okay, we just flip a switch and we were arrogant, but now we're humble, right? It is a process of becoming more humble, better recognizing our limitations, one another's limitations, our collective limitations. And the way to become humble or to be humbled, both individually or collectively, by the way. I mean, so individuals can be humbled. For example, people tend to be really overconfident in the likelihoods they ascribe to certain kinds of events or how likely they think they are to answer a question correctly.
mm,
But when they're questions that actually have right or wrong answers, and you can show people that, oh, well, when you were 85% confident that you had answered a question correctly, all those questions that you answered 85% on, you answered 50% of them correctly, right? So
mm,
you're poorly calibrated. People quickly come into better calibration, like just in a couple of hours.
mm.
Now, so individuals can be humbled, groups can be humbled. Almost all of it depends on the environment from my perspective, and on the environment having five different features. The first is that it elicits kind of evaluable behavior. So individuals or members of a collective have to kind of put themselves out there. They have to say, I think this is right, or I think this is what we should do, or I think this is the case. And it has to be valuable in the sense that there have to be ways of determining when someone is right and when they're wrong, right? Which is
Right.
really key to determining where your weaknesses or limitations are,
So
right?
less about opinion and more about, show me your evidence when we're having a conversation so that there's something to push back on.
Yeah, that's right. So that in a meeting, for example, you could kind of, if there's a point where you're kind of stuck or someone says something and other people are not sure, you can, I mean, now we have tools for doing it. We can stop. Okay. Can someone Google that, please?
Yeah.
Right. So if it's not a valuable behavior, so for example, if people are often hedging their bets, if they're saying things like, well, there's a chance that, right? Well, okay, no matter how things turn out, they can always say, so if it happens, they can say, I told you there was a chance. And if it doesn't happen, they can say, well, I just said there was a chance. I didn't say it would happen, right? You need a more evaluable behavior, which is what you get in these calibration exercises, right? I'm
Right.
75% confident that Ottawa is the capital of Canada or whatever. So, secondly, you need feedback that is actionable. So, if you have this evaluable behavior, you have people who are saying things and doing things that can be evaluated by themselves or by other people, then it's not just enough for them to be doing things that can be evaluated. You need feedback that tells them, collectively or individually, this is what you did well, this is
Mm.
what you didn't do so well on, this is what you got right, this is what you got wrong, so that they can integrate this feedback into subsequent attempts,
Mm.
right? So that's what a calibration exercise is with judgment is, whoa, you're pretty overconfident. And people automatically respond to that, right? That's a kind of piece of actionable feedback where they will tend to downgrade their confidence in their judgments.
Right. So
The
on
third,
a corporate level, I'm thinking of things like writing it down. Like when you have a goal, for example, writing it down so that you can have, an after action review and actually check how things worked out because often we don't. We just like make a decision to move on and then we don't really necessarily learn from the thing that has happened. So there's less correction happening in our system.
yes, that's a great example, right? And that's why we keep minutes in meetings and things like that, right? Why did we think this
Mm.
at that time? What was the mistake that we made?
Hmm.
Right? So it's important. Now, it's important because of the third feature. you want an environment where you have multiple attempts at similar tasks. Otherwise, the feedback isn't particularly helpful. The
Mm.
feedback is in the service of improvement. But the only way that you can improve is with practice, and practice is repeated attempts at similar kinds of things, right? So again, when you're in a meeting that where you're discussing a similar type of decision
Mm.
to something you were doing 4 months ago, how well did that work out last time? Did it work out well? Poorly? Why? Right? How did you handle it? What did you find out afterwards that you wish you had known beforehand, and so on.
Yeah.
Um,
So having a
and it
sense of like group memory or actually bothering to sort of dig up the past in some cases and try again.
Yeah, and one
Yeah.
of the benefits of a collective is that you can try, like trial and error learning is really powerful and it's multiplied in a collective because you can try one thing and I'll try something different,
Mm.
right? And we can learn together which of those is the better approach, as opposed to a single person that tries one thing, gets feedback, tries another, gets feedback, right? So there is a kind of parallel processing that's going on instead of serial processing. So in an organization, controlled experimentation, controlled in the sense of, okay, we're going to deliberately do different things here because we're in a state of uncertainty. So you try A, we'll try B,
Hmm.
right? And we will have a kind of cutoff point where we decide, okay, which of these is going better, right? As opposed to pre-committing, right? So having multiple attempts at similar projects can be the same person trying over and over again, similar things like calibration, or it can be an organization or a collective deciding, okay, we're going to try and solve this thing in different ways and see which one pans out, right? And again, oftentimes that is a humbling experience, especially for those people who are wrong
On the losing team. Yeah.
on the losing team. Yeah. But
Mm.
to do that well, you need a situation where you have kind of motivation, right? You need incentives for everyone to be trying to do their best to succeed and improve, right? As opposed to just conform, for example. So
Mm.
that's the fourth feature is that there is a motivation both to perform for individuals to perform as well as they can, but to do so within the confines of the group, right? So you're kind of prioritizing group success
Mm.
as opposed to individual success. And this is another role that leaders have is by keeping the onus, the attention on this collective goal that everyone shares in common. And then kind of feedback has to do with contributions to the goal, but you keep it as collective as possible. We did well. We made a mistake. We can do better. These kinds of things, as opposed to Sarah had this genius idea, and Jeff, what were you thinking, and so on,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
You want to avoid those kinds of dynamics. And then the fifth and final feature is you want a kind of psychologically safe environment where mistakes are not, or errors are not ruinous, that they are treated generally as learning opportunities. Now, part of that, what's entailed there, is that you don't want people making the same mistakes over and over and over again.
Hmm.
But making a mistake and getting the feedback, the actionable feedback, and learning, that's really valuable. So mo a lot of our learning is trial and error, I would say most of it. And so you have to give people the leeway to make a mistake with the expectation that they will learn something from it. Now, if they're bad faith errors, if they're making mistakes because they are breaking rules or because they're trying to avoid responsibility, all these kinds of things, that shouldn't be tolerated. But in the case of someone who's really trying and just makes a mistake, as we all do, that should be at the very least tolerated, in some cases kind of celebrated, right? Thanks for showing us that this is not, right? Now we know
Mm.
that A is not the way to go, B is the way to go. We've all learned something because you were the kind of canary in the coal mine. You all taught us something, right? Those kinds of things, those opportunities are really powerful in my experience.
Mm.
So those are the five features of what I call humbling environments, and they cultivate humility over time as a process, both individuals who are learning through trial and error and collectives that are learning through trial and error. But it requires a commitment of a collective, whether we're talking about individual humility or collective humility, to cultivate the kinds of environments that have these five features.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, what a workplace that would be. It sounds like it requires a lot of not just commitment, but energy and dedication and patience with one another and openness and all of these other, when I'm thinking about what kind of people it takes to actually pull this off, it brings to mind all kinds of other improvements that, people need to make in order to be that vulnerable, basically, to this kind of process, right?
That's right. Yeah,
Mm,
and again, just to emphasize, I mean, just as no one's going to be perfectly humble, no organization or collective is going to get this exactly right. It's a very, very difficult process, one itself that ought to be approached with humility,
right.
right? And so there's going to take some trial and error here too about how do we instantiate these five features in ways that are going to get us where we want to be more humble and more productive, more accurate, and so on. And so, again, this is the whole thing is a process. We have to see it as such and not think, okay, well, we haven't transformed our organization overnight, so I
Yeah,
guess we're just not up to it.
right.
It's marginal benefits. You want marginal improvements, and it's amazing the kinds of steps that you can make just by making small improvements over time.
Mm. Yeah, and like I think the thing I'm taking away most from our conversation is that the focus ought to be really on those five sort of pillars or those five characteristics of a collective environment rather than taking maybe the same amount or more energy and throwing it at individual people, hoping that if we fix them, everything's going to be great. So that's, I mean, it's hopeful in that way. And I'll take back my doomed word from earlier because I like these strategies. I think they are very hopeful and they do give me a sense that a lot of the work that is done in the fields of leadership and mentorship and coaching and conflict management and change management are kind of on the right track or well aligned with this sort of goal. But it's great. I love the way that you're articulating all of that, and I love this framing for it. It's very useful.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I am both a pessimist and an optimist. I'm a pessimist when it comes to individual human beings. I mean, our brains and our minds are remarkable organs in the case of our brain, but they're fundamentally social.
Mm,
And on our own, there's surprisingly little we can achieve. Most of what we do because we do it together.
mm,
And so together we are in groups. We are an enormously powerful force, precisely because we can aggregate information and knowledge and expertise, and we've learned ways of doing that better and better and better. And yet, when we're talking about training and education, often we're kind of lagging behind and focusing on individuals, even though the power we have really resides in what we can do together. And so, in those kinds of moments, I'm much more optimistic about what we can do in the right kinds of environments with the right kinds of collectives. We can make huge strides, just as, the open science movement did, for example,
for
in,
sure.
in relatively short periods of time. So I'm really hopeful. I think this shift in focus from seeing ourselves as kind of essentially autonomous thinkers to deeply social beings and thinkers and actors and deciders, that I can't really overstate how important I think that shift is.
Hmm. That's great. I want to leave it there, but I will ask you, as I like to do, is there someone whose work you'd like to amplify or tell listeners about in connection to your own?
Yeah, so this is someone who's influenced me quite a bit. He's a cognitive science. His name is Hugo Mercier. And his work he does lots of amazing work. But the stuff that really spoke to me was the work that he's done on human reason and focusing on the social dynamics and the social environments in which we reason and how what look like drawbacks or flaws or deficits when we're thinking on our own and answering kind of questions, just on a piece of paper on our own in a lab, for example, can actually serve us in these collective environments. And so what tend to be weaknesses when they're
Hmm.
manifested by individuals in solitary contexts can actually be something that redounds to everyone's benefit in collectivist contexts. So the book that he wrote with Dan Sperber on this is called The Enigma of Reason. It's a really accessible, wonderful book, and it really did change the way I think about this quite a bit and move me very strongly towards this kind of view of the importance of social cognition, because philosophy is just as, if not more, guilty of this kind of individualistic bias. So I think that book is well worth a read or a reread, and
Awesome. Yeah.
and his work is great.
That's great. Yeah, I'm happy to drop a link to that book in the show notes for any listeners who are curious about digging into that subject. And thank you for telling us about it. Dr. Steve Bland, thank you so much for your presence here today and for giving us so much to think about.
It's been a true pleasure.
For anyone interested in a deeper dive into Steve's work, check the show notes for links to that as always. And of course, I welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast or if you'd like to nominate someone. My email is in the show notes too. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It truly does help get the podcast into more ears. I'm Dominique. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time on Just One Q.